The sky above Serathis IV was a dull gray, thick with dust that never seemed to settle. The planet had once been beautiful, full of lush forests and shining cities. Now it was nothing more than a wasteland. Broken buildings stood like skeletons of a past long forgotten. Rivers had dried up, leaving behind cracked earth. The air was heavy with silence, except for the occasional whispers of wind that carried the sorrow of those who remained. Karish, the leader of the Scifi, stood on a rocky hill, gazing at the ruins below. His heart felt as empty as the land. His people, once proud and wise, were now weak and scattered. They had been abandoned, ignored by the galaxy, left to die on a world that could no longer sustain them. The Galactic Council had once promised them protection, but that promise had been a lie. Decades ago, the Council had turned its back on the Scifi, declaring them a lost cause. One by one, civilizations had stopped trading with them. No ships came to help. No supplies arrived. The Scifi had pleaded for aid, but their cries had fallen on deaf ears. Now Karish had little hope left. The young ones were hungry. The elders were sick. Every day was a struggle to survive. Then the sky changed. A deep hum filled the air as lights appeared above the horizon. The Scifi, weak and tired, lifted their heads in confusion. At first, they feared another storm, but these lights did not belong to nature. They belonged to ships, massive ships, moving in perfect formation. They were not council ships, nor were they pirates. The design was unfamiliar, sleek, strong, and shining like polished steel. The Scifi gathered, murmuring among themselves. Some were afraid, others curious. Was this another cruel trick of fate? Another force coming to take what little they had left? Then a voice echoed across the barren land. A transmission, clear and steady. "This is Captain Elias Carter of the United Earth Fleet. We come in peace. We offer aid." Aid? The Scifi had forgotten what that word even meant. Karish felt his breath catch. He had heard of humans before. They were newcomers to the galactic stage, a young race that many dismissed as reckless and unpredictable. The Council had often spoken of them as troublemakers, a species that did not follow the old ways of the galaxy. But now, here they were, offering help when no one else would. The largest ship, a towering behemoth of steel and power, descended slowly. Dust and debris swirled as its engines roared. The Scifi watched in awe as the ship's doors opened, and figures stepped out. They walked upright, their forms encased in protective suits. Their helmets gleamed under the pale light of Serathis IV's dying sun. And then one of them removed his helmet. A man, with strong features and deep brown eyes, looked at the gathered Scifi with neither fear nor judgment. Instead, his expression was calm, understanding. "I am Captain Carter," he said, his voice carrying across the ruins. "We bring food, medicine, and technology. Let us help you." The Scifi stared in stunned silence. No one had ever spoken to them like this. No one had ever looked at them with such sincerity. Karish, still wary but desperate, stepped forward. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse from years of suffering. "Why would you help us when no one else would?" Carter's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Because that's what humans do." With that, the human crew began unloading supplies. Containers of fresh food, clean water, medical kits, things the Scifi had not seen in years. The people, hesitant at first, slowly reached out. A starving child was given a nutrient pack. An old woman, too weak to stand, was gently carried to a medical station. Hope, a forgotten feeling, began to stir in their hearts. Karish watched it all with disbelief. He had expected deception. He had expected false promises. But instead, he saw kindness. Real kindness. For the first time in decades, the Scifi were not alone. And perhaps, just perhaps, they still had a future. The Scifi had never seen anything like it. The humans worked fast, unloading crates filled with food, water, and medical supplies. They moved with purpose but not with arrogance. Unlike the Galactic Council, who had turned their backs on the Scifi long ago, these humans showed no hesitation in helping. They spoke in a strange but steady language, their words filled with warmth rather than empty promises. Karish stood among his people, watching in silence. He had lived through years of suffering, of watching his people grow weaker as their pleas for aid were ignored. Now, in just a few moments, everything had changed. A young Scifi girl, thin and trembling, reached out for a food pack. A human soldier knelt, offering it to her gently. She flinched at first, expecting cruelty, but the soldier only smiled. Slowly, she took the pack, opening it with shaking fingers. The moment she tasted real food, fresh, nourishing food, her wide eyes filled with tears. Karish swallowed hard. This is real," he murmured, half to himself. Beside him, Captain Elias Carter nodded. "It is." The human leader stood tall, his uniform slightly dusty from the planet's dry air. His dark eyes scanned the Scifi people, reading their expressions, understanding their hesitation. "We brought more than just supplies," Carter continued. "We brought engineers, doctors, people who can help rebuild." Karish's fingers tightened around his staff. Rebuild. The word felt foreign on his tongue. "Why would you do that for us?" Carter exhaled, as if he had expected this question. "Because it's the right thing to do." A simple answer. Yet it held more weight than the Scifi elder could comprehend. For decades, the Galactic Council had taught every species that survival was about strength and power. The weak were abandoned, forgotten. That was the way of the galaxy. And yet, here were humans, young and reckless by the Council's standards, choosing to help without asking for anything in return. One of the human doctors approached, a scanner in her hand. "Elder Karish," she said respectfully, "your people are malnourished, and many are suffering from long-term sickness. We can help treat them, but we need your permission." Karish hesitated. He had been forced to make difficult choices before. He had begged for aid from other civilizations, only to be ignored or mocked. He had seen his strongest warriors fall, seen his wisest elders fade away. But these humans, they were different. He looked around. His people, once too weak to stand, were already regaining their strength. Children were drinking clean water. The elderly were being examined by human doctors, their wounds treated with careful hands. Hope, a feeling long buried, flickered in their eyes. Karish turned back to the doctor. "Do what you must," he said, his voice steadier than before. The doctor nodded and got to work. Meanwhile, Carter walked through the settlement, his expression thoughtful. "This planet isn't suitable for long-term survival," he admitted. "The soil is failing, and the water supply is nearly gone." Karish sighed. "We know, but we have nowhere else to go." Carter exchanged glances with his crew. Then, after a moment, he spoke. "Then we'll find you a place." Karish's heart skipped a beat. You would do that?" "Of course." Carter's voice was firm. "You're not alone anymore." Tears burned in Karish's eyes, but he held them back. A leader had to remain strong, but for the first time in his long life, he felt something he had nearly forgotten. Not just hope, trust. And as the humans continued their work, Karish realized something else. Maybe the Scifi weren't the last survivors after all. Maybe, with humanity by their side, they were the first of something new. For the first time in decades, the Scifi had real food in their hands. Children, once too weak to run, now played with cautious joy. The elderly, who had resigned themselves to slow fading, sat together, warmed by the feeling of hope. But Karish knew that food alone was not enough. He stood with Captain Elias Carter, watching the human engineers set up machines near the ruined city's edge. The humans had arrived with more than just supplies. They had come with technology, knowledge, and determination. A young Scifi warrior named Vekra approached Karish, her golden eyes full of cautious curiosity. "Elder, these humans, They do not act like others, she said softly. Karish nodded. No, they do not. Vecra hesitated, then turned her gaze to Carter. Captain, she said, why do you care for us? The Galactic Council has ignored us for years. Other species look away when they see our suffering. But you fight for us. Why? Carter turned to face her, his expression serious but kind. Because that's what we do, he said. Humanity doesn't abandon those in need. Vecra narrowed her eyes. Even if it brings you trouble, Carter chuckled. Especially then. Karish watched as Vecra processed his words. The young warrior had grown up knowing only hardship. To her, kindness without an agenda was difficult to understand. But Karish understood something deeper. These humans were not here for gain. They were not here to conquer or claim power. They were here simply because they chose to be. Still, there was one problem that could not be ignored. This planet is dying, Karish admitted. You have already seen the signs. The water is almost gone. The soil is turning to dust. And no matter how much food we receive, we cannot grow anything here. Carter crossed his arms, deep in thought. Then we'll find you a new home. Karish's heart clenched. You say that so easily. Because I mean it, Carter replied. Earth has colonies, allies, places where you could live safely. We'll speak with our leaders and find a world where the Scifi can thrive again. Karish's breath caught in his throat. A new home. Could such a thing truly be possible? Then, a sharp alarm rang through the air. The humans turned, weapons ready. The Scifi froze. A human officer ran up to Carter. Sir, we've detected incoming ships, non-human. Karish's blood ran cold. He already knew who it would be. The Galactic Council, he murmured. Carter's expression hardened. They ignored you for years, and now they decide to show up. Karish clenched his fists. They never wanted us to die too quickly, only to suffer until we faded away. But now, they see that we have hope again. Carter's jaw tightened. They don't want you to recover. A chill settled over the gathering. The children were pulled back into shelters, and the Scifi warriors stepped forward, though they were few in number and weak from years of struggle. Carter looked at them, then at his own people. He saw their exhaustion, their desperation, but he also saw something else. Determination. His voice was calm, but unshakable. Let them come, he said. We're not leaving, and we're not letting them take you. For the first time in history, the Scifi were not alone. And this time, they would not be abandoned. The sky above the ruined Scifi city darkened as massive ships descended. Their sleek silver hulls gleamed in the fading sunlight, their engines humming with quiet menace. The insignia of the Galactic Council was stamped on their sides, a reminder of the power that had ignored the Scifi for decades. Karish stood still, gripping his staff tightly. Around him, his people trembled, old wounds of fear reopening at the sight of those ships. These were the same rulers who had turned away when the Scifi begged for help, the same leaders who had declared them unworthy of protection. But this time, things were different. This time, the humans stood with them. Captain Elias Carter and his soldiers were already in position. They didn't raise their weapons first, but they didn't lower their guard either. Their armor, though worn from travel, gleamed under the twin suns of the planet. Their eyes were sharp, ready. The first council ship landed. A tall, blue-skinned official stepped out, his robes flowing like liquid metal. His silver eyes scanned the gathered Scifi before settling on the humans. I am Administrator Velm of the Galactic Council, he announced, his voice smooth but cold. We were informed that unauthorized activity is taking place on this world. His gaze flickered to the supply crates, the medical equipment, and finally, to Carter. Explain yourselves. Carter didn't flinch. We're helping them, he said simply. Velm frowned, as if the idea was incomprehensible. Helping them. He let out a small laugh. Human, you do not understand the ways of the galaxy. This race has been abandoned for a reason. They are weak, unable to sustain themselves. It is the natural order. Karish's grip on his staff tightened, anger burning in his chest. These were the same words the council had always spoken, empty justifications for cruelty. Carter took a step forward, his expression calm but firm. Weak, he repeated, or just ignored. Veln sighed, as if speaking to a child. It is not our concern what happens to species that cannot adapt. The council does not interfere with failure. Carter's jaw clenched. That's not failure, he said. That's abandonment. Veln's eyes narrowed. This is not your matter, human. Step aside. The Scifi will be left to their fate, as it was meant to be. Carter shook his head. Not anymore. Veln's expression darkened. Are you defying the council? Carter didn't hesitate. Yes. A silence fell over the gathering. The Scifi held their breath. They had never seen anyone speak back to the Galactic Council before, never seen anyone challenge them so directly. Veln's voice dropped to a warning tone. Do you realize what this means? If you interfere, you will be considered enemies of the Galactic Council. Carter smirked, but there was steel in his voice. You ignored them for years. And now, suddenly, you care. No, the only reason you're here is because you see that they're recovering. With us. He took another step forward. You don't like that, do you? Veln's expression remained neutral, but his fingers twitched, a sign of frustration. Humanity is still young. You do not understand how dangerous it is to oppose the council. Carter tilted his head. Funny, he said. I was about to say the same thing to you. For a brief moment, Veln hesitated. The humans didn't have a large fleet here. They weren't heavily armed. And yet, there was something unsettling about them. They were unshaken, unafraid. Veln exhaled sharply. This is not over, he warned. The council will not tolerate disobedience. Carter crossed his arms. Then bring everything you've got. The administrator turned sharply, motioning for his officers to follow. They entered their ships, and within moments, the council vessels lifted off, disappearing into the sky. Karish let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They will return, he murmured. Carter nodded. Let them. Karish turned to him, his old eyes filled with something new, something he had not felt in decades. They will bring war, he said softly. Carter met his gaze without fear. Then we'll be ready. And for the first time in Scifi history, they were not alone. The night sky above Serethis Prime was no longer peaceful. It shimmered with the lights of approaching warships, large, cold, and ruthless. The Galactic Council had returned, just as Administrator Veln had promised. But this time, they weren't here to talk. Karish stood on a rocky outcrop, his heart heavy as he watched the sky. The council had abandoned his people for years, yet now they came with an armada, simply because the Scifi had found protectors. It was as if the council feared their recovery more than their suffering. Behind him, Captain Elias Carter and his soldiers were making preparations. The humans were not as advanced as the council's forces, not in numbers, not in technology. But they had something else. Determination. Scifi warriors, young and old, stood alongside them. For the first time in generations, they had weapons, training, and most importantly, hope. They had lived in fear for so long, but now, they were ready to fight. Carter looked at Karish. It's time, he said simply. Karish nodded. He turned to his people, his voice strong despite the fear in his heart. We have been left to die before. We have been ignored, pushed aside, forgotten. He took a deep breath. But now we stand together, and we are not alone. The Scifi warriors let out a determined cry. Carter turned to his soldiers. You all know the plan. We don't need to defeat the entire fleet. We just need to show them that we won't back down. A soldier next to him smirked. Let's give them a reason to regret coming here. The battle began in an instant. The first wave of council ships descended, their energy cannons lighting up the sky. But before they could fire, Human anti-air turrets roared to life, sending powerful bursts of energy toward the attackers. A few ships veered off course, dodging the fire, but one wasn't fast enough. It exploded in a bright flash, crashing into the barren land below. Karish watched in awe. The humans had set up these defenses in only a few days, yet they were already proving their worth. On the ground, the battle was fierce. Council troops, clad in their gleaming armor, stormed forward, expecting an easy victory. They had conquered countless civilizations before, what was one more forgotten race. But they had not expected resistance. Scifi warriors, guided by human tactics, fought back with everything they had. They weren't the weak, helpless race the Council had once ignored. Now, they had shields, weapons, and the will to stand their ground. Carter and his soldiers moved through the battlefield with precision. He fired his rifle, taking down an advancing Council trooper, then ducked behind cover. "Push forward," he shouted. The Scifi moved as one, their formations tight, their strikes swift. For the first time, the Council was struggling. A Council officer shouted orders, frustration clear in his voice. "This is impossible." The Scifi were supposed to be weak. But they weren't weak. They had just never been given a chance to fight before. The battle raged on for what felt like hours. Ships fell from the sky, flames rising from the wreckage. The ground was littered with damaged Council equipment. It was clear the Council had underestimated them. Finally, a signal came through on the human comms. One of Carter's soldiers grinned. "Sir, they're retreating." Carter let out a breath, glancing up. The remaining Council ships were pulling away, their engines burning bright as they fled back into space. Karish couldn't believe it. "They're leaving," he whispered. Carter nodded. They thought this would be easy. He turned to Karish, a proud smile on his face. But they were wrong. The Scifi warriors cheered, their voices echoing across the land. It was not just a victory. It was proof. Proof that they were worth defending. Proof that they were stronger than the galaxy had ever believed. Karish looked at Carter, gratitude filling his heart. "We could not have done this without you." Carter shook his head. "No, you could. You just needed someone to remind you." The Scifi had spent decades being ignored, but now they had shown the galaxy that they would not be forgotten again. And the war was far from over. The battlefield was silent now. Smoke rose from the wreckage of fallen ships, and the last fires flickered against the night sky. The Scifi had won their first battle, but Karish knew this was only the beginning. He stood beside Captain Carter, both of them watching the stars. Somewhere out there, the Council was regrouping, planning their next move. They would not accept this defeat easily. "They'll be back," Karish said, his voice steady. Carter nodded. "Yeah, but so will we." The humans worked quickly, gathering supplies, repairing damaged equipment, and strengthening defenses. Scifi warriors moved among them, their steps no longer uncertain. They had fought, they had survived, and now they knew this was their home, and they would not let anyone take it from them. But the victory had come at a cost. Many Scifi had been wounded. Some had fallen. The survivors honored them, standing in silence as the names of the lost were spoken. Karish clenched his fists. His people had already suffered so much, and now they were paying for their freedom with blood. Carter placed a hand on his shoulder. "They didn't die for nothing," he said firmly. "The Council thought you were too weak to fight. Now they know the truth." Karish took a deep breath. He was tired, but he could not rest yet. "We need to know what the Council will do next." Carter agreed. "I'll send out a recon team. We need information before they hit us again." A small human ship took off into the sky, disappearing into the stars. Meanwhile, the Scifi and humans continued preparing. Days passed. The air was tense, but the people remained determined. Then, a message arrived. The human scouts had returned, their ship landing with urgency. A soldier ran up to Carter, his face grim. "Sir, you need to hear this." They gathered in the command tent. The scout team leader, a sharp-eyed woman named Lieutenant Hayes, pulled up a holographic display. A large fleet was visible, moving through space. Even through the recording, the size was intimidating. "They're bringing everything they have," Hayes reported. "Multiple battleships, carriers, and ground forces. More than before. They aren't underestimating us this time." Karish felt a chill run down his spine. The first attack had been brutal enough. This was a full invasion. Carter crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "They're not just trying to crush you. They're sending a message to anyone who thinks about resisting." The room was silent. The council had abandoned the Scifi before, but now they were willing to destroy them just to prove a point. Karish turned to Carter. "Can we stop them?" Carter didn't lie. "Not in a direct fight. They have too many ships, too many soldiers." The Scifi leader exhaled slowly. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew they couldn't surrender now. "What do we do?" one of the Scifi warriors asked. Carter looked at them all, his eyes sharp and thoughtful. "We can't fight them head-on," he admitted. "But we don't have to. If they expect us to fight like a traditional army, we'll do the opposite." Karish frowned. "You mean a different strategy?" Carter nodded. "Exactly. Hit and run. Ambushes. Disrupt their supplies, cut off their communications. Make them regret stepping foot on your land." The Scifi warriors exchanged glances. It was not the way they had fought in the past. But their old ways had not saved them. Maybe this time it would be different. Karish took a deep breath and looked at his people. "We will fight," he said firmly. "Not because we have no choice, but because this is our home, and we will not let them take it." The warriors straightened, their eyes filled with determination. Carter nodded in approval. "Then let's get to work." The battle was coming. And this time, the Scifi would not just defend. They would strike back. The skies above the Scifi homeworld darkened as the massive council fleet arrived. The enemy ships were like a storm, filling the atmosphere with their presence. Battleships, carriers, and thousands of soldiers were ready to bring destruction. The message was clear. The council would not tolerate defiance. Karish stood at the front lines, his warriors behind him. Their fear had turned into something else: determination. They had lost their home once before. They would not lose it again. Captain Carter and his human soldiers stood beside them. The humans had no obligation to fight this war, but they had chosen to. They had given the Scifi something no one else had: hope. The Scifi homeworld was no longer defenseless. With human help, they had built hidden bases, set traps, and prepared for war in ways the council would never expect. They were no longer waiting to be crushed. They were ready to fight back. The battle begins. The first attack came from orbit. The council ships fired massive energy blasts at the surface, targeting key locations, but the humans had planned for this. Shield generators, salvaged from old council technology, absorbed most of the impact. The land shook, but it did not fall. Then the dropships came, thousands of council soldiers landing across the planet, ready to wipe out the Scifi. Karish gripped his weapon. "This is it." Carter smirked. "Let's make them regret coming here." The battle exploded across the planet. The Scifi, once seen as weak and helpless, now fought with everything they had. They struck from the shadows, using hit-and-run tactics to confuse the enemy. Humans provided cover fire, their advanced weapons keeping the enemy at bay. Every time the council tried to advance, they found themselves ambushed. Scifi warriors, once trained only for defense, now fought like ghosts, striking hard and vanishing before the enemy could react. A turning point. As the battle raged, something unexpected happened. A transmission was intercepted from one of the council ships. Hayes, the human scout, rushed to Carter. "Sir, you need to hear this." The message played over the radio. "Why are we even fighting? The Scifi were harmless before. Now they're resisting, and humans are helping them. This isn't what I signed up for. Another voice responded. I don't want to kill them. This isn't right. It wasn't just one soldier. Many of the council troops were beginning to hesitate. The Scifi were supposed to be weak, unworthy of survival. But now, they were proving their strength, their will to live. Some council forces started to withdraw. Others turned against their own commanders. The battle was shifting. The final strike. Karish saw the hesitation among the enemy forces. It was their chance. We push forward now, he shouted. The Scifi and humans launched their final attack. They struck deep into the enemy's ranks, targeting command units and cutting off communications. The council forces, already uncertain, began to break. One by one, the enemy ships retreated. Some surrendered. Others simply left, unwilling to fight a war they no longer believed in. Finally, the last council battleship turned and fled. It was over. The Scifi had won. A new future. Karish stood among his people, looking at the sky. For the first time in generations, it was clear. No warships, no threats. Only freedom. Carter walked up beside him. Told you we'd make it. Karish smiled. We would not have done this without you. Carter shrugged. That's what friends do. The Scifi were no longer an abandoned race. They had fought for their place in the galaxy. And thanks to humanity, they had won more than just a battle. They had won a future.